I sat perfectly still in the leather chair, the kind that creaks when you shift your weight, but I didn't move an inch. The conference room was too quiet, the way rooms become when something irreversible is about to be spoken aloud. Across the polished table, my daughter-in-law Lauren sat with her hands folded, calm as still water. She wore a charcoal blazer and the small pearl necklace my late husband Richard had given her on the day our son married her. The lawyer, Mr. Barrett, an old friend of Richard's who had handled our affairs for decades, adjusted his glasses and began reading the last will and testament. The words started out ordinary: charitable bequests, small gifts to longtime employees, provisions for the grandchildren. Then came the main body of the estate: $77 million. Properties in 3 states. The commercial holdings. The investment portfolio Richard had built over 40 years. All of it, Mr. Barrett read in his steady voice, passed to Lauren as sole executor and primary beneficiary. My name appeared only once. A single line near the end. To my wife Evelyn Harlow, I leave my gold pocket watch and the contents of my personal library. That was all. No mention of the house we had lived in for 42 years. No mention of the trust we had set up together. No income. No security. Just a watch and some books. Lauren turned toward me with an expression of practiced sorrow. Her eyes glistened but no tears fell. She reached across the table as if to touch my hand but stopped short. I didn't offer mine. I felt the room tilt slightly, the way it does when blood leaves your head too quickly. I had spent the final 18 months of Richard's life at his bedside. I had learned how to change the oxygen tubing, how to spoon broth into his mouth when swallowing became difficult, how to read his eyes when words failed him. Lauren had visited when her schedule allowed, which was rarely. Yet now she controlled everything we had built. Mr. Barrett closed the folder. The sound of it was soft, final. Lauren offered quiet words about Richard's wishes, about how he had wanted to simplify things so I wouldn't be burdened. Her voice was gentle, reasonable. No one in the room questioned it. I stood, smoothed my skirt, and thanked Mr. Barrett for his time. My legs carried me out of the office and down the elevator without shaking. Only when I reached the parking garage did the first wave of cold realization hit me. I sat in the car for a long time, staring at the steering wheel, feeling the weight of the pocket watch that wasn't yet in my hand pressing against my chest all the same. That night I walked through the house as though it belonged to someone else. The grandfather clock in the hallway still ticked with the rhythm Richard had loved. His coat still hung in the closet, carrying the faint trace of cedar and the cologne he wore for decades. I ended up in his study, the one room Lauren hadn't yet entered to organize. The desk lamp cast a warm circle of light over papers he had left unfinished. I opened the bottom right drawer, the one he always called his emergency drawer, and found a small velvet pouch I didn't recognize. Inside was the gold pocket watch mentioned in the will, along with a plain USB drive and a folded note in Richard's handwriting. The note was brief. Ev, only if things don't feel right. Trust your gut. R. I stared at those words until they blurred. Richard had never been a man for secrets, yet here was something hidden. My fingers trembled as I plugged the drive into my laptop. 3 folders appeared. One contained scanned copies of an earlier trust document, dated 4 years ago, where my name stood beside his as co-trustee and equal beneficiary. Another held a series of emails between Richard and Lauren from the final year of his life. The last folder contained photographs, close-up images of signatures on new documents, taken quickly, as if in secret. I read until the sky outside turned from black to gray. The email showed Lauren pressing Richard to update the estate plan for efficiency. Richard's replies grew shorter over time, hesitant. One message from him stood out. I'm not comfortable removing Evelyn completely. Let me think about it. There was no reply from Lauren after that. By morning I understood this wasn't a simple change of heart. Something had been arranged while Richard was at his weakest, and he had suspected it enough to leave me quiet breadcrumbs. I closed the laptop and sat in the dim study, listening to the house settle around me. For the first time since Richard's passing, grief gave way to something sharper. Not anger yet, just a clear, steady determination. I would not simply accept this new version of my life, not without understanding how it had been written without me. The pocket watch lay on the desk, ticking softly. It felt heavier than gold should. I picked it up, pressed it to my palm, and made a silent promise to the man who had worn it every day of our marriage. I would find the truth he had tried to protect. The days after the will reading passed in a strange hush. The house felt larger than it ever had, every room echoing with absence. I moved through my usual routines, watering the orchids on the sun porch, folding laundry that no longer included Richard's shirts, brewing coffee for one instead of two. But everything carried a new weight. Lauren called once, leaving a gentle voicemail about arranging a time to go over the transition details. I let it sit unanswered. I kept returning to Richard's study. The USB drive stayed in my possession, tucked into the velvet pouch with the pocket watch. I studied the scanned documents again and again, comparing dates and signatures until my eyes burned. The earlier trust was clear. Richard and I were equal partners in everything. The newer versions removed me entirely. The signatures on those newer pages looked too perfect, too uniform for a man whose hands had trembled even when signing birthday cards in his final year. One afternoon I spread the photographs from the drive across the desk. They were close-ups Richard must have taken in secret, his own signatures on fresh documents, captured with a phone camera. Next to them I placed hospital discharge papers and prescription bottles from the same months. The difference was stark. The writing on medical forms wavered, looped unevenly. The estate signatures were steady, almost mechanical. I felt a chill settle in my chest. Someone had guided that pen, or worse. I needed help I could trust. After 3 sleepless nights I picked up the phone and called Harold Whitaker, Richard's oldest friend and the attorney who had drafted our original estate plan years ago. He had retired to the coast but still kept his license active. When I said my name, his voice warmed immediately. I asked if we could meet. He suggested his home the following morning. I drove the 2 hours in silence, the pocket watch resting on the passenger seat like a quiet companion. Harold's house overlooked the ocean, simple and weathered. He greeted me at the door with a firm hug and led me to a sunlit kitchen that smelled of strong coffee. I placed the velvet pouch on the table between us. He listened without interrupting as I explained the will reading, the sudden changes, the contents of the drive. When I finished, he sat back and rubbed his chin the way he always did when thinking hard. He asked to see the photographs first. I watched his face tighten as he compared the signatures side by side. Then he opened his laptop and pulled up public records of the filed will. The document matched what Mr. Barrett had read. My name absent except for the watch and books. But the filing date raised his eyebrows. It had been recorded only 6 weeks before Richard passed, during the period he was in and out of consciousness. Harold made notes on a yellow legal pad. He pointed out details I had missed. The witnesses to the new will were not people Richard knew. One was a notary from Lauren's law firm. The other was an associate in the same office. Richard had always insisted on independent witnesses, neighbors, golf partners, people with no financial interest. This felt too neat, too contained. We spent the afternoon tracing timelines. Harold requested certified copies of medical records from the hospital, power of attorney forms, visitor logs, medication schedules. Patterns emerged. On the days the new documents were supposedly signed, Richard had been heavily medicated. Lauren had been listed as the primary visitor those afternoons. I had been sent home to rest, encouraged by the nurses at her suggestion. By evening Harold closed his notebook and looked at me steadily. He said this wasn't mere preference or late-life clarity. It looked orchestrated. He knew a probate specialist named Beatrice Lang. Sharp, discreet, experienced in contested estates. He offered to reach out on my behalf. I agreed without hesitation. For the first time since the reading, the fog in my mind began to lift. On the drive home the ocean faded behind me, but a new clarity stayed. I no longer felt like a woman waiting to be told her place. I felt like someone beginning to reclaim it. Back in the house that night, I opened Richard's closet. His clothes still hung in perfect rows. I pressed my face into one of his jackets, breathing in the faint trace of him. Grief rose sharp and sudden, but beneath it ran something stronger. Resolve. I whispered into the fabric that I was listening to the warning he had left me. I would not let his doubts go unanswered. The next morning Beatrice Lang called. Her voice was calm, professional, with an undercurrent of steel. She asked me to bring everything I had to her office downtown the following week. I gathered the drive, the watch, the printed photographs, and Harold's notes into a plain folder. I placed it in my purse beside my wallet, as though it were ordinary paperwork. But it felt like carrying evidence of a different life, the one Richard and I had planned together before illness and influence rewrote the ending. I stood in the kitchen watching dawn break over the garden Richard had tended so carefully. The roses were still blooming late, stubborn against the coming frost. I thought of how he used to say roots run deeper than anyone sees. I touched the cool glass of the window and made another silent promise. Whatever had been buried, I would uncover. Not for money, not even for justice alone, but because love deserves the truth, even when it arrives too late to change the past. The week before my meeting with Beatrice Lang felt both endless and fleeting. I kept the folder close, carrying it from room to room as though it might vanish if left alone. Mornings found me at the kitchen table, sunlight spilling across the photographs and printouts, tracing the differences in Richard's handwriting with a magnifying glass. I had once bought him as a joke. The steady lines on the new estate documents mocked the shaky scrawl on his last grocery list. I began to see patterns I had missed before. Dates that aligned with hospital stays, timestamps on emails that arrived late at night when Richard had already been asleep for hours. Harold called every few days with updates. He had obtained visitor logs from the hospice facility. Lauren's name appeared far more often than I remembered, especially on afternoons when the nurses encouraged me to go home and rest. Those same afternoons matched the dates on several of the revised trust amendments. Harold's voice remained calm, but I could hear the growing concern beneath it. He reminded me to keep everything quiet until Beatrice reviewed it all. Confrontation too early could give Lauren time to cover tracks. I followed his advice. When Lauren texted about scheduling a walkthrough of the house to inventory personal items, I replied with a simple message saying I needed a little more time to sort through things myself. She responded quickly with understanding emojis and a note about respecting my grief. The words felt hollow on the screen. Beatrice Lang's office sat on the 23rd floor of a downtown building with floor-to-ceiling windows. The elevator ride-up gave me too much time to second-guess everything. By the time the doors opened, my palms were damp. Her assistant led me down a hallway lined with abstract paintings in muted blues and grays. Beatrice waited behind a wide desk, standing to greet me with a firm handshake. She was younger than I expected, perhaps early 50s, with short silver-streaked hair and eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. I placed the folder in front of her and sat. She opened it without comment and began reading. Page by page, she turned the documents, occasionally pausing to make small marks with a red pen. The only sound was the soft scratch of her writing and the distant hum of city traffic far below. I watched her expression shift, first concentration, then a slight narrowing of the eyes, then something harder to read. When she reached the signature photographs, she leaned closer, holding them to the light. After what felt like hours, she closed the folder and leaned back. She asked quiet questions. Exact dates of Richard's hospital admissions, the names of attending nurses, whether I had copies of his medication schedules. I answered as completely as I could. She listened without interrupting, taking notes in neat, small handwriting. Then she laid out what she saw. The timing was too convenient. The witnesses too connected to Lauren's firm. The signatures too inconsistent with Richard's documented physical decline. She explained that in cases of potential undue influence, courts looked for patterns, capacity, isolation, sudden changes favoring one party. Everything here pointed in that direction. She recommended starting with a quiet motion to freeze the estate assets. It would prevent any transfers or sales until a full review could take place. It wasn't aggressive, she said. It was protective. I felt a knot in my stomach loosen for the first time in weeks. Protective. The word settled over me like a warm blanket. I signed the retainer agreement with a hand that no longer trembled. On the drive home, rain began to fall in soft sheets across the windshield. I turned off the radio and let the rhythm of the wipers fill the silence. For years I had prided myself on trusting family without question. Richard and I had built our life on that foundation. Now I saw how trust could be used as a blindfold. Lauren had counted on my willingness to accept Richard's supposed wishes without challenge. She had counted on grief keeping me quiet. But grief has its own seasons. The raw ache was still there, but beneath it something new was growing, clear-eyed determination. That evening I walked through the garden Richard had loved. The late roses drooped heavy with rain. Petals darkened to deep crimson. I clipped a few and brought them inside, placing them in the crystal vase on the dining table, the one we had bought on our 25th anniversary trip to Venice. The scent filled the room, rich and old-fashioned. I sat with a cup of tea and the pocket watch open on the table before me. The hands moved steadily forward. I thought of how Richard used to wind it every night before bed. A small ritual that grounded him no matter how chaotic the day had been. I realized then that the watch wasn't just a bequest. It was a reminder. Time keeps moving, even when everything else feels frozen. And I still had time. Beatrice called 2 days later. The motion to freeze the estate had been filed. A hearing was scheduled within the month. She warned me that Lauren would likely respond strongly, perhaps with accusations of confusion or greed on my part. I told her I was ready. The truth had been waiting long enough. I hung up the phone and stood at the window watching dusk settle over the neighborhood. Lights began to glow in neighboring windows, families gathering for dinner, ordinary evenings unfolding. For the first time since the reading, I didn't feel shut out from my own life. I felt like someone stepping back into it, one careful footfall at a time. The rain had stopped. In the quiet that followed, I could almost hear Richard's voice telling me to trust my gut. I had ignored that inner voice for too long, mistaking silence for peace. Now I understood the difference. Peace would come when the full story was told, not the version written in haste while a good man lay dying, but the one we had built together over decades. I closed the pocket watch with a soft click. Tomorrow would bring whatever it brought. But tonight, the house felt a little less empty. Tonight, I was no longer waiting to be told my place. I was claiming it. The court's order freezing the estate arrived on a crisp autumn morning, delivered by courier in a plain white envelope. I opened it at the kitchen table, sunlight slanting across the marble counter, and felt a quiet wave of relief wash over me. No funds could be moved, no properties sold, no investments shifted until the review was complete. It wasn't victory, but it was breathing room. For the first time since the will reading, time was no longer slipping away from me. Lauren's response came swiftly. A thick packet from her attorneys landed 2 days later. Polished letterhead, measured language accusing me of acting out of confusion and unresolved grief. They claimed Richard had been of sound mind, that his decisions reflected years of careful thought, and that my challenge was causing unnecessary distress to the family. They demanded I withdraw the motion or face countersuits for legal fees. I read it once, folded it neatly, and placed it in the folder with everything else. Beatrice called that afternoon. She had expected something like it. She said we would answer with facts, not emotion. Discovery began in earnest. Subpoenas went out for medical records, office visitor logs from Lauren's firm, email correspondence, and notary records. Beatrice worked methodically, building a timeline on a large whiteboard in her conference room. Red strings connected dates, hospital admissions, document signings, Lauren's visits. The pattern grew clearer with every addition. Richard's capacity had been weakest on the very days the most significant changes were made. One evening Beatrice called me at home. She had received the first batch of documents from the law firm. Among them was an internal memo from 6 weeks before Richard passed. It instructed staff to expedite amendments to the Harlow estate plan and to remove discretionary clauses that required spousal consent. My name appeared once in a single line. Eliminate co-trustee status per client directive. There was no attached directive, no note from Richard. Beatrice said that absence spoke volumes. I began to notice small changes in daily life. Neighbors who had offered quiet condolences now asked careful questions about the estate. Some mentioned seeing moving trucks at the storage unit Lauren had rented. Others spoke of emails from her requesting donations in Richard's memory for causes he had never supported. Word was spreading, not through gossip, but through the slow ripple of doubt. People who had known Richard for decades began to wonder aloud why everything had shifted so completely, so quickly. Then came the breakthrough I hadn't dared hope for. Beatrice received a discreet email from a young woman named Chloe Reeves, a junior associate at Lauren's firm. Chloe asked for a confidential meeting. She would not speak over the phone or by email. Beatrice arranged it for a Saturday morning at a quiet cafe far from downtown. I insisted on being there. Beatrice agreed, though she warned me to listen more than speak. We arrived early and chose a corner table near the window. Chloe appeared right on time, mid-20s, dark hair pulled back, carrying a simple canvas bag. She looked exhausted, as though sleep had been scarce. She ordered tea but didn't drink it. She began slowly. She had been brought into the Harlow estate revisions late in the process. Certain procedures had been rushed, standard reviews skipped, meetings held without full attendance. One Sunday evening she had stayed late to finish billing hours. She passed the conference room and saw Lauren with a small stack of documents. Lauren asked her to step in and witness the signature page. Chloe hesitated because Richard wasn't present. Lauren explained he had just stepped out for a call, and that time was critical. Chloe signed as requested. It bothered her afterward. Enough that she made a private note in her personal planner. Date, time, observation that the client had not been in the room. She had kept that planner. She brought it with her, sliding it across the table. The entry was clear, handwritten in blue ink. Beatrice photographed the page carefully. Chloe went on. She had overheard parts of phone conversations, phrases about accelerating distributions, liquidating holdings quietly. One call came just days before Richard's final hospitalization. The words had stayed with her because they felt cold, transactional. Chloe wasn't seeking attention or revenge. She had a young daughter, rent to pay, a career to protect. But the more she learned about the challenge, the more her conscience pressed. She wanted the record to be accurate. She was willing to provide a sworn statement if needed. I sat quietly through it all, hands wrapped around my cooling coffee. When she finished, I thanked her softly. Her eyes met mine for the first time and I saw fear there but also relief. She left quickly afterward, head down against the autumn wind. Beatrice and I stayed at the table long after she was gone. The planner entry changed everything. It wasn't just questionable signatures now. It was direct evidence that a key document had been witnessed improperly. Combined with the medical records showing Richard's condition that weekend, it painted a picture no reasonable court could ignore. On the drive home, the leaves had turned fully, carpeting the streets in gold and rust. I rolled the window down and let the cool air fill the car. For months I had carried the weight of being erased, of having my life's partnership reduced to a watch and some books. Now the weight was shifting. Not gone but shared. The truth was gathering allies. That night I placed the pocket watch on my bedside table and wound it carefully, the way Richard used to. The soft tick filled the quiet bedroom. I thought of how he had always said a watch doesn't just tell time. It reminds you that time is yours to spend wisely. I had spent too much of it doubting myself, accepting a story that didn't fit the man I knew. No more. The evidence was growing piece by careful piece. Lauren's polished narrative was beginning to show cracks. And for the first time I slept through the night without waking once. The weeks following Chloe's statement felt like standing on solid ground after months on shifting sand. Beatrice moved quickly. Chloe's planner entry became the cornerstone of a formal deposition. Security logs from Lauren's firm confirmed no record of Richard entering the building on the Sunday in question. Medical charts showed heavy sedation that entire weekend. Piece by piece, the picture sharpened into something undeniable. Lauren's legal team grew quieter. The aggressive letters stopped. Instead came requests for extensions, then offers to mediate privately. Beatrice declined each one. She wanted everything on record in daylight. The preliminary hearing was set for early December. It would not decide the entire case, but it would determine whether full discovery, every email, every phone record, every bank transfer, would proceed. I prepared in small ways. I boxed up Richard's clothes for donation, keeping only his favorite navy sweater. I cleared the guest room of old files, making space for the growing stack of legal documents. The house began to feel less like a museum of loss, and more like a place where life was still happening. Neighbors stopped by with casseroles and quiet questions. Some admitted they had wondered about the sudden changes. Others simply offered company. I accepted both. One gray afternoon an invitation arrived in the mail, thick cream stock, gold lettering. The annual Founders' Dinner for the Children's Hospital wing Richard had helped establish decades ago. Lauren was listed as host and incoming chair of the board. The event was 2 weeks away, just days before the hearing. I held the card for a long time, tracing the raised letters. It felt like a final performance, a chance to cement her position publicly before the court could intervene. Beatrice advised against attending. Could be seen as provocative. Harold thought it might give Lauren false confidence. But something in me needed to be there. Not to confront, not to accuse, but to be present in a space Richard had cared about deeply. I decided to go. Alone. The night of the dinner arrived cold and clear. I chose a simple black dress and the pearl brooch Richard had given me on our 30th anniversary. The venue was the old ballroom downtown, crystal chandeliers glowing against dark wood paneling. Familiar faces filled the room. Doctors who had benefited from Richard's grants, families whose children had been treated because of his vision, board members who had worked beside him for years. Lauren stood near the center, radiant in emerald silk, greeting guests with warm handshakes and practiced smiles. A large portrait of Richard hung behind the podium, recent, taken when illness had already thinned his face. I disliked the choice but said nothing. I moved quietly through the crowd, accepting condolences, listening more than speaking. Near the silent auction tables, I overheard fragments of conversation. People wondered why the transition had happened so quickly. Some mentioned hearing about estate complications. Doubt had begun to spread like frost across glass. When dinner ended, Lauren took the stage to announce her formal acceptance as board chair. She spoke eloquently about Richard's legacy, about continuing his work with fresh energy. The room listened politely. Then the current chairman, Dr. Ellis, an old colleague of Richard's, stepped forward unexpectedly. He thanked Lauren for her enthusiasm but noted that, due to recently raised administrative questions, the board had voted to postpone any permanent appointment until matters were clarified. Lauren's smile held, but her eyes flickered. She recovered quickly, offering understanding words about caution and respect for process. The applause was thin. I remained near the back, hands clasped in front of me. A few board members noticed me and nodded gravely. One woman, Margaret, who had served with Richard since the beginning, approached afterward. She asked if the rumors were true, about challenges to the will. I answered honestly but briefly. She pressed my hand and said the board would wait for facts. Her eyes held steady support. Lauren found me near the coat check as the evening wound down. She approached with the same composed expression, though her grip on her clutch was tighter than necessary. She asked how I was holding up, mentioned the stress of transitions. I met her gaze and said I was managing one day at a time. Nothing more. She nodded, wished me well, and moved away. I watched her go, feeling neither triumph nor pity, only a deep weariness at how far things had drifted from truth. Outside, the night air was sharp. I walked to my car slowly, breath visible in small clouds. The city lights reflected off wet pavement. For months I had felt like a ghost in my own story. That night, for the first time, I felt solidly present. Seen. Not as a widow to be managed or an obstacle to be removed, but as Richard's partner of 42 years, still standing. The hearing loomed closer. Evidence continued to arrive. More emails, more inconsistencies. Chloe's deposition had been recorded and filed. The handwriting expert's final report confirmed significant doubt about the disputed signatures. Beatrice said we were as ready as we would ever be. I drove home through quiet streets. The house waited, lights glowing from the timer I had set. Inside, I hung my coat and went straight to Richard's study. The pocket watch sat on the desk where I had left it. I opened it, listened to the steady tick. Time had felt stolen from me for so long. Now it was returning minute by minute. I thought of the dinner, of Lauren on that stage, of the board's careful pause. Change was coming, not through shouting or drama, but through the slow, inexorable weight of truth. I closed the watch and placed it in my palm. It was warm from the lamp. I carried that warmth with me to bed, and for the first time in months, sleep came easily. The next chapter of our story was about to be written, not in secret, not in haste, but in open light. And I was ready to turn the page. The preliminary hearing arrived on a cold December morning, the sky low and gray as though holding its breath. I dressed carefully, a simple wool coat, the pearl brooch pinned at my throat, and drove downtown with the folder on the seat beside me. Beatrice met me outside the courthouse, calm and steady. She reminded me that today was only about establishing probable cause for deeper review. We did not need to prove everything, only enough to open the door. Inside the courtroom, the air felt thick with formality. Lauren sat at the opposite table, flanked by two attorneys in sharp suits. She wore navy, hair pulled back severely. She did not look in my direction. Mr. Barrett, the original estate attorney, was present as well, called as a witness. His face carried lines of discomfort. Beatrice presented first. She laid out the timeline with quiet precision: Richard's declining health, the rushed amendments, the questionable signatures, the improper witnessing. She introduced Chloe's deposition, the handwriting analysis, the medical records. Each exhibit was handed to the judge in orderly binders. The judge listened without expression, occasionally making notes. Lauren's lead counsel rose next. He argued capacity, intent, family prerogative. He painted Richard's decisions as deliberate, born of long consideration. He suggested my challenge stemmed from grief and misunderstanding. His tone remained respectful, but the implication hung heavy. An aging widow clinging to what was no longer hers. Then Beatrice called Mr. Barrett to the stand. He confirmed reading the will exactly as filed, but when shown the earlier trust, the one Richard and I had signed together years before, he admitted the changes were substantial and sudden. He acknowledged that Richard had never discussed removing me during prior reviews. A small shift crossed his face, regret, perhaps, or simple honesty. The judge asked a few direct questions about timing and witnesses. Answers came slowly. The room grew quieter. When the session ended, the judge ruled from the bench. Probable cause existed. Full discovery would proceed. The asset freeze would remain in place. A formal trial date would be set after documents were exchanged. Lauren stood quickly as court adjourned. Her attorneys gathered papers with practiced efficiency. She finally glanced my way, brief, unreadable, then turned and left. No words. No confrontation. Just the soft click of her heels fading down the corridor. Outside, snow had begun to fall in fat, silent flakes. Beatrice walked me to my car. She said the ruling was stronger than expected. Lauren's team would likely seek settlement now. I nodded, watching the snow settle on the windshield. It felt fitting. Something clean covering the exhaustion of the past months. The shift came faster than anyone predicted. 3 days later, Beatrice called. Lauren's attorneys had requested a private meeting. No admission of wrongdoing, but a proposal. Lauren would withdraw as executor and primary beneficiary. The original trust structure would be restored. The foundation board would revert to its prior governance. In exchange, I would agree not to pursue further claims or public disclosure. Beatrice laid out the terms carefully. It wasn't full accountability, but it was restoration. My place beside Richard's name would return. The house, the income, the legacy, all intact. I asked for time to think. That evening I walked through the garden under fresh snow. The roses stood bare now, branches etched white. I thought of Richard's hands planting them decades ago, of promises made in quieter times. I accepted the proposal the next morning. Not because I forgave easily, but because the truth had already done its work. The documents were refiled. My name reappeared where it had always belonged. The foundation issued a brief statement about honoring original intent during transition. Lauren stepped away entirely. Winter deepened. I spent afternoons sorting Richard's papers, archiving old grant files, preserving the story of what we had built before anyone tried to rewrite it. The house filled again with small sounds. Tea kettle whistling, fireplace crackling, the steady tick of the pocket watch on the mantel. Spring arrived gently that year. Snow melted into the earth, and the garden woke slowly. Daffodils pushed through first, bright against dark soil. I visited the children's hospital wing one April afternoon. The board had invited me to review an upcoming scholarship expansion. The halls smelled of antiseptic and fresh paint, but children's laughter echoed through. I walked the corridors Richard had helped fund, touching plaques that still carried our names side by side. No one asked me to take an official role. I didn't seek one. I simply offered guidance when asked, ensuring the mission stayed true to what we had envisioned together. It was enough. One warm evening I sat on the porch with a glass of iced tea, watching fireflies begin their slow dance over the lawn. The pocket watch rested in my hand, warm from the day's sun. I opened it and listened to the familiar rhythm. Time had carried me through the darkest stretch, and now it moved forward with gentler cadence. I thought of Lauren only in passing now. I did not hate her. Hate requires too much energy, and mine was needed elsewhere, for living, for remembering, for tending what remained. The truth had not roared. It had simply persisted, quiet and unyielding, until everything false gave way. The garden Richard planted flourished that summer. Roses bloomed fuller than they had in years. I cut bouquets often, filling the house with their scent. Each petal reminded me that roots run deep, deeper than any temporary storm. I kept the watch wound. I kept the house open to friends and neighbors. I kept Richard's memory alive not in grand gestures, but in small steady acts, funding a scholarship here, mentoring a young doctor there, walking the garden paths he loved. Some stories end in fireworks. Mine ended in quiet light. I had not been erased. I had simply refused to disappear. And in that refusal I found my way home, to the life Richard and I built, to the woman I had always been, to the peace that comes when truth finally has its say. The snows would return, and the roses would sleep again. But spring always follows. And I would be here, steady as the tick of the watch in my hand, living the years we were meant to share. Even if some of them now belonged only to me. Thank you for walking this journey with me. If you have ever had to stand quietly for what was right, know that your strength leaves ripples longer than you imagine. Sometimes the greatest inheritance is not money, but the courage to protect what truly matters.